Well, salutations, fellow idiots. Welcome back to yet another episode of that full moon madness, baby. Today we are sipping on some Japanese plum wine. Highly recommend picking this up if you guys can get it in your area. It is absolutely delightful. It is delicious on the rocks, it's delicious chilled, it's delicious warm, it's just fucking delicious. It's also great for marinating with lightly spiced food or pairing with fruit or chocolate-based desserts. So, give that a try as well. Now, we're not going to be pairing it with any of that, and we're certainly not going to be marinating any spicy food, but we are going to pair it up with 1994's Lurking Fear, which is our current review in our current wave of reviews. This was an absolute fucking rental classic for me as a kid. Definitely not, the best full moon movie of the era. It's certainly not the worst either. It's just a good time. It's a nice, straightforward, no-nonsense fucking siege movie with some real cool creatures and a recognizable cast of characters. So while it's definitely not top tier in Full Moon's early library, it's well loved by a lot of fans, myself included, and hopefully today, by the end of this review, we can impress upon you why you should check it out immediately. Lurking Fear was written and directed by Full Moon regular C. Courtney Joyner. It was produced by Charles Band. It stars Blake Bailey, Ashley Loren, John Finch, Jeffrey Coombs, Vincent Schiavelli, Allison Mackey, Paul Manti, and Joseph Levengood. It's got cinematography by Adolfo Bartoli, music by Jim Manzi. It was distributed by Paramount Home Video and Full Moon Entertainment, and it was released at some point in 1994. So the basic gist of Lurking Fear is this dude John Martens, played by Blake Bailey, is an ex-con freshly released from prison after serving a 5-year sentence for a crime that he didn't commit, an unspecified crime. We don't ever get to know what it was, but we do know that he didn't commit it, and he was basically just convicted because of his last name being Martens. His father was a notorious fucking criminal that was well known for being a notorious criminal, and on account of him leading this life of crime, he didn't have much of a relationship with his son. Unfortunately, while John was in prison, his dad also was in prison and passed away, but it turns out that he left him an inheritance of sorts. So John returns to his childhood home of Lefferts Corner and meets up with a family friend named Specs, played by Vincent Schiavelli. He's a local mortician who, it just so happens, helped John's father stuff a corpse full of cash that he stole from a casino before he died. This corpse is buried in the local cemetery, and Specs is nice enough, in exchange for 20% of the take, to hook John up with his half of the map that shows the location of the grave within the cemetery. And this would all be a simple enough get-rich-quick scheme to cash in on his father's nest egg that he left him, if it wasn't for the fact that this town of Lefferts Corner is basically deserted on account of the fact that it's infested with these creatures that live in these subterranean tunnels under the ground and come up at night, like during these rainstorms, to feast on the flesh of the locals. Basically, anybody who hasn't been eaten by these creatures has left town, so it's essentially a ghost town, completely abandoned with the exception of the local priest, played by Paul Manti, the local doctor, played by Jeffrey Coombs, and the local ass-kicking action hero chick, played by Ashley Loren from Hellraiser. Basically, her and the local doctor have set about, trying to rid the town of these creatures. They're out there at the cemetery currently because that seems to be, the main nest of these monsters. And they've got it all rigged with explosives, and they have this whole plan to, blow all the graves up and then pour gasoline with this tanker truck down into the tunnel system and light the fuckers on fire. Our boy John Martens ends up wandering into this situation, totally unaware of these creatures. He's just trying to dig up this corpse and get this money. Unfortunately for him, they're not really welcoming any visitors out of fear that he might fuck up their entire plan to, finally beat these creatures back. It just so happens that him and Specs weren't the only people aware of this scheme of this corpse filled with cash. The owner of the casino that his father robbed is this mobster dude played awesomely by John Finch. He shows up with his sidekicks, Miss Marlowe and Pierce, played by Allison Mackey and Joseph Levengood respectively, and they pretty much take everybody hostage and demand that they help them get this cash out of this corpse or they're gonna start fucking killing people. Pretty quickly, this all just unravels, though, on account of, that minor creature infestation that we mentioned earlier. So they all end up trapped in this church together, and it basically becomes a siege movie with them trying to, fight off each other while simultaneously trying to avoid getting devoured by these mongoloid motherfuckers living underneath the cemetery. And overall, the movie plays out pretty much the way you would expect. They trade places on who's taken who hostage a couple of times. They get assaulted by the creatures, and we've got a few people added to the body count of the film. There's lots of gunfire and explosions, and overall it's pretty awesome. The characters are all pretty interesting. The plot of the movie is pretty unique, I think. Corpse full of cash buried in this cemetery that happens to be overran by these creatures. They just kind of narratively ruin it a bit by tacking on like a needless subplot where John Martens is actually related to this clan of mongoloid cannibals or whatever on account of his dad running away from home, I guess, and eventually, having him. But it doesn't really make a lot of sense considering they all look like mutants and his dad, while ugly, was just a normal human, much like himself. I'm sure maybe that part of the story comes from the actual H.P. Lovecraft story that this is loosely adapted from, but the entire movie would be no different if that subplot didn't exist. They could have had this out-of-the-way backwater town just been the spot where they stashed this corpse because it was an out-of-the-way backwater town. Ashley Loren's backstory makes a lot more sense to the events of the film because her sister was killed by these creatures, so she's vowed revenge. And that's why she's a badass, because she spent years training with this local doctor so that they could eventually carry out this plan. And despite the setbacks of all these extra people getting involved, they actually do manage to eventually pull it off. The movie really ends in a way that kind of leaves you almost set up for a sequel that they obviously never made. And honestly, as fun as most of this movie is, it probably doesn't deserve a sequel. If they trimmed off the pointless subplot of the whole Martens family thing and cleaned up the script in a few places and got rid of the chick that played the pregnant girl because she just couldn't act, and also decided not to dub over John Martens's father like he is in a bad kung fu movie, then I think the movie would be a lot better than it turned out to be. It really is a great example of some wasted potential. Amazing setup, interesting cast of recognizable characters, cool creature design, even the creatures talking and trying to make a deal with the priest and stuff before ripping his heart out. All that stuff could still have been left in the movie and expanded upon. Maybe instead of having the wooden pregnant chick, they could have had a couple other just random people get murdered by the creatures. I think as it stands at the end of the movie, the body count is pretty much even between the humans just killing each other over this money and the creatures actually getting to folks. So more creature action, just more creatures in general, and trimming out the awkward, cheesy bits would have made this movie deserving of the sequel I think they were trying to set up at the end. Lurking Fear's certainly got its issues, but as I said at the beginning of this, it's just a fucking good time, man. It fits in perfectly when you're trying to marathon movies because it's straightforward. It's got a real short run time of only 76 minutes, so you can blast through it real quick. It's the perfect intermission when you wanted to go as a kid and get the 5 movies for 5 days for $5 deal at the local video store and just blast through a bunch of movies with your friends on a Saturday night. It's got all those recognizable people from other genre films and whatnot, so that makes it just an enjoyable experience. As far as the issues it does have, the main one is definitely the script. It could have been a lot better. There are moments in the film where everybody's performances shine, but then there are other moments where they seem like they're kind of begrudgingly reading the lines because old Courtney Joyner presented them to them and they didn't have a choice. Lurking Fear is also an unfortunate bit of Full Moon history in the fact that disputes over its budget led to them being dropped from their deal with Paramount. Now, reality is, even if things had stayed perfect between Paramount and Charlie Band, eventually they would have dropped Full Moon anyways. I'm sure the deal wouldn't have lasted much longer than the late 90s, but it definitely would have helped in terms of getting those later 90s flicks out there to the public in a more widespread way. They still made it into the video stores, but I feel like not as many of them did after the Paramount deal fell through. That stuff aside, while it has its flaws for sure, it will always have a soft spot in my heart. It will always be part of the regular full moon rotation in this motherfucker, and hopefully it will become part of yours. That's all we got on this one, guys. As always, I have been Mosley. You have been a bunch of sexy beasts, and this has been yet another episode of that full moon madness, baby. Cheers. Thanks for watching.
The world of Full Moon lives online at fullmoondirect.com. Classics like Puppet Master, Demonic Toys, Subspecies, and more recent favorites Ginger Dead Man, Evil Bong, Killjoy, and more can be found at fullmoondirect.com on DVD, Blu-ray, limited edition box sets, replicas, toys, shirts, and more. Only available at fullmoondirect.com.